Gulag.
Present.
Senator Paolino.
Here.
Senator Acosta is here. Senator Kano.
Here.
Senator Murray.
Present.
Senator Seveny.
Here.
Senator Sisnowski.
Here.
9 members. There is a quorum.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Thank you to the members for joining us today, and also thank you to the many members of the administration that are joining us as well. Today we're going to begin hearing on the governor's proposed budget. This is our first hearing of that budget, and we're going to start today on an issue that is very important to this committee and to the Senate, housing. We're going to hear Article 16 related to housing today, as well as an update from Rhode Island Housing on the Rent Relief Rhode Island program. As the members of the committee will remember, we did have a hearing earlier this session on housing, and Rhode Island Housing has prepared an update for us to that program that we will hear this evening as well. To start it off for the evening, as we typically do, Joe, I'd like to turn over to you to make the initial introductions from the budget office, and then we'll leave it to you to proceed with the rest of the individuals that will be participating from the administration for the presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Joe Kadiga, Deputy Budget Officer, and I'm here to introduce the members of the administration that will be testifying tonight. So to begin with, I'll pass it along to Secretary of Commerce, Stephen Pryor, who will introduce the article and will be accompanied by Hannah Moore, Commerce Chief of Staff, and Mike Tundra, Chief of the Office of Housing and Community Development. I'll join in later to talk about some of the fiscal and revenue impacts of Article 16. And then finally, we'll conclude with some testimony on rent relief from Chris Hunsinger of Rhode Island Housing. And with that, I will share my screen and pass it along to Secretary Pryor.
Thank you, Joe, and Mr. Secretary, welcome to Senate Finance.
Thank you, Chairman. Good to be with you, honorable members of this committee. Pleased to be speaking with you about housing. It's a critical issue in the midst of this COVID crisis. It was already an important issue prior to the pandemic, but it has become all the more so. We're going to talk to you about that today and get inside our proposals with the chairman's permission. I'll be tag teaming this presentation with Hannah Moore from Commerce, our Chief of Staff. So let's go to the next page if we can. We want to start with the overall housing challenge. Chairman, members of the committee, we've talked about this before, but it's certainly important to review and to update our figures. As you can see, building permit activity is substantially down, and affordability is likewise down. The competitiveness of our market, the heated nature of our market, is ever increasing. Look, with one of my hats on, that's a good thing because it is a strong market. The problem is that it is in effect overheated, especially in comparison to nearby states. We're crowding out buyers and renters of every income level, definitively including individuals and families seeking affordable housing. But it's a problem that's occurring across income brackets. So a few points on affordability. The National Association of Realtors has ranked Rhode Island one of the 5 least affordable states in the country. We're behind California and New York on affordability. The median sale price for a single-family home in Rhode Island increased by 14% over last year. Multifamily home sales increased by 19%. In January of 2021, January of this year, the median single-family sale price was $334,000, which was a 32% increase over the median sale price in the same category in January of 2019. Now, we know that there was high interest during the pandemic in housing purchases, but this is a disproportionate increase. And the problem is that when the market overheats in one place, it's putting pressure on all aspects of the market. People in higher income brackets are purchasing housing stock and renting units at levels that are below that they can afford. and they're crowding out people who are in search of affordable housing. So it's a significant problem. On condo pricing, we saw an increase of approximately 11% over that same time period, 2021 to 2019. Another key point about availability of housing stock, one of the things that we track is the number of months of inventory available. Just shows you how tight the market is. A balanced homeownership market is said to have 5 to 6 months of inventory in an available state. In the churn, Rhode Island has 1.4 months in the way of supply of homes for sale versus 5 or 6 months, which is healthy, and that's 46% lower than a year ago. We have the second lowest rental vacancy rate in New England, which, look, again, from a, if you will, pure commerce perspective, you like to see a healthy market, but this is beyond healthy. It's too tight. The vacancy rate is 3.2%. Average rent is now above $1,200 for all unit sizes. So you get the idea. There is a problem in the overheated nature of this market, and we need to solve it in multiple ways. And we want to talk about multiple financing methods, bond plus a steady revenue stream. And we want to talk to you about other ways of helping communities partner with the state, which is part of the same picture, but an important point to pull out and talk about. So on this point about building permits, which is the largest portion of this slide, the most prominent portion of this slide, I want to point out what this is showing. Even if you're looking at it on your screen, you may have to squint. So I want to highlight some points here. We're building half of what we were building in 2005. If you look at the bar chart, that's what it's illustrating. Half of what we were building in 2005. And in terms of housing starts, in terms of preliminary data, we're at 1,329 housing starts in 2020. That's pretty good for the recent history of Rhode Island. That is to say, it's the second highest housing start figure since the Great Recession. So that's good. We're getting better. But in 2005, Rhode Island had 2,836 versus what I just expressed, 1,329. Think about that. So we've got a long way to go before we get to 2005 levels of housing starts, meaning construction of new housing units. And the state loses an estimated 500 or more units every single year because of demolition, deterioration, unutilizable housing stock, or demolished and therefore completely unavailable. So we have a problem. Next slide, if we can. Compared to our neighboring states, we're not investing in housing at an appropriate rate. So Massachusetts and Connecticut invest more than 4 times as much every year as we do in housing. We are the only jurisdiction in New England that does not have a reliable, dedicated funding stream for housing. So we want to get into that and talk about that more, Hannah and I, with Joe's assistance and other colleagues on the line. Other states have passed housing bonds. We're very grateful that this committee, the Senate, and the General Assembly as a whole saw fit to place on the ballot the $65 million bond, and it passed, and the electorate supported that initiative. Thank you for that. But it's not enough, and we've got to do more to stay competitive with our fellow states. And let's keep in mind, we're coming from behind. So every year we're not competitive with our fellow states, we're falling much further behind in the compound nature of this problem. Hannah, anything else you'd want to point out on this slide?
I think you covered it very well, and Chair and committee, I'd point out that the reliability, just as Secretary Pryor is explaining it, year after year, having years where we're not able to fund projects because the bond ran out, it really hurts the momentum, and it decreases the confidence that we have in the development community as well. So places that have dedicated funding streams are able to developers are able to continue looking for new projects with confidence, knowing that there will be funding that's available. And so it's not only a compounding problem, but it's also just highly disruptive.
And on the specific mechanism of a conveyance tax, that would be a supplemental stream of funding and a dedicated one for this purpose. It's worth noting that in the Northeast, Connecticut, Vermont, New York, and New Jersey already use a tier-based system where they have a threshold and they dedicate a portion of the tax. We'd be in very good company using this approach. And again, just matching other states in terms of having such an approach is a step towards helping us get where we need to be, which is, we ought to be a leader among states in producing affordable housing and in making more stable and more rational our housing market. Next slide, if we can. So the Article 16 proposals, which, Mr. Chairman, as you expressed, is the subject of the hearing. We've already referred to this in describing the problem, but we aim to develop a funding stream for housing production that is a flexible stream to help create a healthier, more sensible market within Rhode Island, resulting in more affordable housing and more workforce housing for Rhode Islanders. That funding stream at a full year's total accumulation will result in $6.7 million per year in a new restricted receipt account. It'll be more like $3 million for fiscal 22 because it's a partial year. That's the reason. But it'll gear up to 6.5 to 7 million a year. We'll talk to you in greater detail later in our presentation about the exact structure. The dedicated fund would be administered and deployed by Rhode Island Housing, which has accumulated the expertise and the capacity to carry out this work. We're grateful to Carol and her team for just consistently doing a terrific job. And several Rhode Island Housing colleagues are on the line, including Chris Hunsinger, who's going to speak with you about the $200 million fund for rent relief. But we're very grateful to Rhode Island Housing. There would be a routinized and very important process around community input, stakeholder input from providers, from advocates, from other representatives of the community, and cross-agency from within the government. It would complement our periodic bonds, but it's just not enough to rely on the one-time dose of a bond periodically. We need this routinized, dedicated funding stream, and we'd support a variety of initiatives. I'm going to get into some of them. Affordable housing production and preservation being chief among them, workforce housing and preservation being chief among them, but also some activities that we think are very important to start doing in earnest. And that is partnering with municipalities. And I think I'm going to get into that on another slide, so I'm going to postpone slightly. We also have a provision that we are going to be introducing to avoid double taxation on affordable housing projects. Hannah, would you just speak to the supplemental legislative requests that will be made on that point?
Absolutely. So some of the committee members may be familiar with this from the fiscal 21 proposal, fiscal 20 proposal, excuse me, that's the same thing. But it basically, when affordable housing projects are structured, they are currently being taxed more than one time. One of the times is really a paper transaction, and we are proposing to eliminate that so that they don't have to suffer that burden. But there will be language that OMB is working to introduce.
When we share that with this committee, which will be subsequent to this hearing, with your permission, we'll provide some revenue impact figures, some cost impact. But my recollection is this is hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. It's not millions. It's a modest amount. And I think it's on the low end of the hundreds of thousands range. It's a modest amount, but for an individual project, it can be nettlesome. It can be a problem for the given developer, and this is for affordable housing. So I want to get into, let's go to the next slide, and I want to talk about the collaboration with municipalities, as I've referred to.
Mr. Chairman,
Or with cities.
Mr. Secretary, if I could, I've got a couple questions from committee members on, I think, the last couple of slides there, if you don't mind me
Of course.
having them jump in. Senator Kano, I know you had a question.
Thank you. Really appreciate the presentation. I just really have a question in regards to the funding stream for housing production that you say is flexible. That you say is going to be like around 6.7 million per year, which I'm
Yes,
pretty
sir.
glad to hear about these. My question is in regards to that flexibility that you talked about. Is that flexibility, and I'm going to be consistent because I'm always asking this, is that flexibility going to have some restrictive for eligibility, for some restrictions for eligibility when it comes to the people that could apply to be on these affordable rental houses that are going to be either built or rent, to be tied to a status, or like those, the immigration status will be like, void because this, like, this is to serve our low-income communities, and this is a group that is certainly very impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. So when you talk about flexibility, does that mean that it's going to be for all?
Yeah, got you. I don't know if my colleagues, Carol Ventura or Chris Hunsinger, are on and able to unmute. But I think that is purely a function, Senator, of the rules on the operation of Rhode Island Housing and integration of these funds with other federal funds, like LIHTC, the low-income housing tax credits. The limiting factor will not be state rules, but federal rules when this is infused into a federal development. I don't know if Carol or Chris can unmute, or if we'd rather get back to the senator.
So that is, which I understand that, and I'm sorry, I wanted to follow up. That is, that's a little problematic to me when I do know that there is amazing programs, for example, in Pawtucket and Central Falls, through one of the partners agencies. They do an amazing job, but when I do have families in certainly need that are in this waiting for their, status to be completed, they are not able to qualify. And these are the families that are really in need of these opportunities to get into these affordable housing projects. So I understand that there is restrictions that you have to have, but I was wondering if there's a way to separate the state funding with the federal funding at some level to make sure that at least the state funding, we would have opportunity for all Rhode Islanders to be able to access these affordable housing projects.
Let me try. I'm not sure if Carol or Chris are able at this moment in time, but let me make a couple of comments that I'm confident in. Some of these funds will be dedicated to enabling towns to conduct planning and development for housing stock that likely does not include a federal component. And there'd be no reason why a town couldn't simply quite literally pave the way for the development of housing, and that housing would have no restrictions whatsoever. So some of these funds will be used in that way. And that I'm very confident in saying. It's when we build income restricted 80% AMI housing that uses 9% LIHTC and 4% LIHTC credits, where I think there may be prohibitions that are federal, and I want to be realistic. I never want to give you a partial answer, Senator. We can't build that depth with that depth of affordability without the federal credits. So that's where I'm looking to my Rhode Island Housing colleagues for their responses. But what I'll say to you is that there will be a component of this funding stream that perhaps for the first time builds housing without any restrictions, just in accordance with towns' own plans. That I'm confident in. Now, I think Carol's trying to unmute.
Can you hear me, Stefan?
Yes, thank you so much, Carol.
Okay. Hi there. Hi, Senator. How are you?
I'm great, thank you.
It's good to see you. So there is a great deal of flexibility with the state dollars, and Stefan is spot on. Some of the federal resources have very strict requirements around things like status, right? But I think that we have examples of very good developments that we've constructed over the years with bond funds that just use bond funds and perhaps lead funds, which don't carry those restrictions around status. So I think it's very likely that we will see applications come in for these state dollars that will build good housing or renovate existing housing for residents in your area.
That is very good news, and I'm looking forward to follow that, and hopefully making sure we have more understanding when those projects come into place, to see what municipalities are able to have those projects built that are going to benefit the group that I'm talking about, that is certainly in need of affordable housing. So thank you so much for the information. Really appreciate that clarification.
Thank you, Senators.
Thank you, Senator Kano, and thank you, everyone. Senator Sisnowski.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can hear you great.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Stefan, for this presentation. I just had a couple of quick questions before we went too further on. The Housing Production Fund that we're talking about, is this a collaboration, ideas that came up in Rhode Island, or is this modeled what some other New England states are doing?
It's definitely both, and I'm glad you asked that, Senator. The notion of a conveyance tax-based, reliable, dedicated fund is definitely borrowed from many, many other states, including New England states. Mm-hmm. The way this one is structured is somewhat of a Rhode Island design in the notion of dedicating it to Rhode Island Housing, which is our comprehensive housing agency, having community input. Those are homegrown Rhode Island structures. Then there's one particular strand of this idea that's borrowed from Massachusetts, and that's the town piece. And if I can go to that next slide, I'll speak to it a little bit more. Massachusetts has for decades now had a set of programs that have become known as 40R and 40S. This may be a subsequent generation of program, but in Massachusetts, which is the source of inspiration for this particular strand, the state offers compensation to a town that is willing to develop a new tract for the purpose of housing when that town is able to demonstrate that additional schooling expenses will result from the new homes containing families with children newly entering the school system. We haven't taken that idea whole cloth. We've actually adapted it a bit, but it's inspired by that, and it's the 40S component of the Massachusetts structure. And what we want to be able to do is, under the Rhode Island housing governance structure, have a portion of the funding. What I'm talking about here, Senator, by the way, is hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, not millions. So it's a modest amount, relatively speaking, but it could make a big difference. Massachusetts, the last time we checked, and the COVID recession may have affected figures, but say 2 years ago, even Massachusetts didn't get beyond the range of $250,000 to $500,000 a year for the entire state. And what they were doing is offering some partial compensation to towns. What we will develop, working on a close basis with the League of Cities and Towns and working with interested towns, is a system where if it can be demonstrated that per pupil expenditure will have to go up, we'll offer partial reimbursement for a town that's interested.
Okay. So
that piece, I'm glad you honed in on that in terms of where we looked for examples. That piece is borrowed from there.
Good. And so that enables, in Massachusetts, that enables the towns to use some of that funding to assist with the planning, to assist with the compensation for the education and so forth. Okay, good.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
And
planning can be done even separate from the whole school issue. We'd like to dedicate some funds, again, hundreds of thousands of dollars. I mean, those monies are very meaningful, but they won't swamp the entirety of the fund for technical assistance to towns on any aspect of what they want to do. It doesn't even have to relate to the schools in that subcategory.
Yeah, because that's good to hear, because I do think there some towns are ahead of others, but I think if they know they have some funding that's going to assist them in planning, adjusting comprehensive plan, subdivision regulations, that's huge to a lot of these towns.
Exactly.
So The other question I had very quickly, mentioned on the previous slide, I believe, the double taxation on affordable housing projects. I know the amendment is forthcoming, but what is that? How does that occur, the double taxation?
It's really a technical flaw in the way we conduct taxation. And since I got Carol Ventura successfully to unmute, she's more expert than I. Would you mind, Carol, explaining this point?
Happy to, Stefan.
Thank you.
There's two periods where tax credit developments are taxed. The first one is the purchase of the initial property, right? And it's generally nonprofits. Most of our business in Rhode Island around tax credit deals are nonprofits. And then the investor purchased the tax credits that are associated with the development. And when the investor who purchases those tax credits exits, they leave, and they generally transfer their interest to the nonprofit for $1. They're then taxed again. So it truly is a double taxation. And as Stefan mentioned, it's really a limited amount of money. Generally, it doesn't exceed $100,000, $125,000 per development, and we may preserve 10 deals a year, but it can make the difference in preserving a transaction and having enough resources to do that, or having to hold that property with no long-term affordability for a period of time. So it is very critical for our tax credit deals.
I would think so. And now, is this unique to Rhode Island general law, or is this something that goes on in other states?
I don't know of other states having this type of taxation issue, Senator.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
You're
Appreciate your answers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator DePalma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, thank you for being here, and Director as well. Secretary, two questions.
Please.
With regards to the aid to cities and towns with potential education costs.
Yes.
We have existing cities and towns, and I could think of one who has a burden of that right now. Are we addressing that at the same time?
Not with this measure. Obviously, Governor McKee and this body and the General Assembly as a whole can speak to per pupil expenditures and the broader subject of education finance. But this is really aimed at a community that's willing to step up and take on new housing designed for families.
No,
Going forward. But it's a fair question. No, it does not.
Okay, I appreciate. I think it's something we should consider, Mr. Chairman. I think of a city like Newport that I represent that has a significant amount of affordable housing there that does have an education burden, and we've had in some of our committees in education, maybe finance, joint hearings where we've had Superintendent Germain speak to us about some of the nuances that Newport experiences that you wouldn't necessarily believe or think about until you really look at the numbers, and you can't just look at the surplus numbers. You got to look at the rate and the change in numbers from one month to the next. Okay. The second question, thank you for that answer, much appreciated. When we look at the $6.7 million number, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later on, let's forget about how it comes about. I know how it comes about, and we'll talk to that when we get to the actual article in the bill. If we were to look, always try to look at it from the perspective, and we've had this conversation over I don't know how many years now, when we first upped the conveyance tax a few years ago to provide some money. Probably not enough. But if we were to figure out of the conveyance tax, we take more of it, then it goes to the general fund or wherever it goes to. The 6.7 million per year, what should that number be? So we do it. I'll just say rhetorically, we never is a long time. You never say all, none, never, and forever. But what should that $6.7 million number be so we wouldn't have to go out to bond in the future, because we know how much it's going to cost us to pay back. So if we don't have it today, if you can let us know what that number is, that we believe we would need annually to support what we're trying to do here.
Happy to give you that figure.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Acosta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my question is somewhat related to this. My guess is This is going to depend largely on the market. And so you could feel free to kick this down the road. But I had a question about how you're calculating this 6.7 million, because this is coming from a conveyance tax on sales in a given year. And so which year are we using? The market right now, as you mentioned, is in some ways unique, or in a different place than it is when it's usually trending. And so because this is based on what's being sold in a particular year, what would be the lowball estimate of the 6.7 million? And if keep crunching at this hot pace that we're on, what would be the highball estimate, right? So the benefit of this, of saying it's, you know, we're going to be moving 60 cents of every, of the 230 above the 700, whatever, is great if we're selling a lot. If we're not, then we might be in trouble, right? And so what are the more optimistic estimates and what are the more conservative estimates?
I think OMB is best positioned on that. With our gratitude, they've done some of the calculations. Joe, would you be in a position to respond, or would you like to do so subsequently following the hearing with the senator?
Sure, Senator. I can tell you what the estimate is based on, and I can follow up with you on some recent statistics. So this estimate is based on the assumptions that go into our revenue estimating conference of the real estate conveyance tax proposal, and that does factor in, to the best of our ability, the principal's ability in the conference, the kind of remarkable growth that's happened in home prices that you're alluding to. So it does factor that in, our best guess of it anyway. And that's the method we use to make the estimate. I think in recent years, revenue from that tax has gone up very strongly, in the range of 5 or 10% annually. And I can get you some of those exact statistics. And absolutely, the actual revenue from this tax will be driven by actual sales. So whatever the market actually does, we might overshoot this estimate or undershoot based on what the market does.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Joe. Okay, Mr. Secretary, I think we are good to proceed down. I think slide 6 is where we may have cut you off.
Thank you, Chairman. Perfect. I think I've covered 6 in response to questions, so I'm going to go right on to 7 to benefit the committee and keep on track. So let's go to 7. Next slide, please. Perfect. Governance changes. We want to modestly strengthen the governance structure for housing within the state. We recognize that with the arrival of new dollars, a substantial bond, we hope a dedicated revenue stream, we should gear up for the additional capacity necessary. So I'll give the very high order explanation and then ask our excellent Chief of Staff, Hannah, to explain a little bit more. But bottom line is we've kept the terminology and the fundamental structure that pre-exists. Of course, there's a Housing Resources Commission in our state. It's a 28-person body. We're looking to make that a more manageably sized body for real dialogue and real decision-making. The history of it is that the HRC was birthed as a planning body, not a resources allocation commission, but it has remained fundamentally in its form. So I'm going to ask Hannah to describe how we're evolving that. And then within the HRC, there's a coordinating committee that's on the books now and in existence, in practice now. And what we aim to do is make that more of an interdepartmental, interagency organization within government that's more capable of reflecting the various forms of expertise inside a governmental administration, but also recognize that there's now an executive office of Health and Human Services and an executive office of Commerce, both of which were created after the HRC and the coordinating committee. And we want to represent them to enable supportive services and the needs for such services to be represented. The construction production side of housing to be represented, all of that in one room. So with that as an overview of the really rather surgical changes we're making, I want to ask Hannah to explain them.
Great, thank you, Secretary. So I'll dive in first on the Housing Resources Coordinating Committee. So the Housing Resources Coordinating Committee was created in the statute as a way to say, okay, we've got multiple agencies and departments who play a role in housing. How are we going to organize ourselves to figure out, okay, who's doing what? How do we work together to bring our resources to achieve our goals? And as Secretary Pryor explained, things have changed a lot in state government since 1998. So it's hard to overstate how significant the role of our Executive Office of Health and Human Service colleagues are in this dialogue. And it is so fundamental to be able to say, okay, when we're thinking about how we're going to spend these funds, how do we work together? And so we're really trying to set that table to kind of elevate the dialogue and elevate the coordination that's possible across all of those groups. Another point that I'll make is that the federal government has also made changes in that time, and institutions like the Continuum of Care, which is a federally required group that oversees a lot of the homelessness resources for the state. And I mean, they're an extraordinarily fundamental part of the conversation and the equation when it comes to tackling housing and homelessness. This also provides them a seat at the table as well. So that's the Housing Resources Coordinating Committee. The way that the Coordinating Committee works right now, they're all members of the Housing Resources Commission. And what we're aiming to do, as Secretary Pryor said, is really just try to enable this group to be a little bit more nimble. And there's obviously an enormous diversity of perspectives that are needed to dialogue about housing resources, and it tries to provide a little bit more flexibility while also preserving the range of stakeholders who really need to be at the table. Additionally, the proposal speaks to, and the statute right now has an executive director position that has not been fully funded in a number of years, and this budget proposes to fund that position. And also, it creates some interlocking. So it says, okay, we're going to fund this position. We're also going to connect them with the Rhode Island Housing Board by placing that person, the executive director, on the board, as well as the Housing Resources Commission chair on the board of the Rhode Island Housing, so that they, as non-voting members, but just to continue the dialogue and make sure that we're fully working together on every aspect, as we do very closely already, and this would double down on that. A couple of other additional points to make about Article 16. There's an existing requirement to produce a strategic housing plan every 5 years, and we've seen things change very frequently, and we're proposing to align that with the 4-year administration cycles. And last point, the Office of Housing and Community Development was never actually codified in statute. It was established by an executive order. And this statute, the article proposes to codify OHCD's role and elevate them to a division of housing and community development. So we're happy to answer questions, but that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you, Hannah, Mr. Secretary. So I do have a couple questions just on this proposal. So, I do think it's really important that we restructure some of the, administrative roles here. I think housing is even more important of an issue now than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when some of this was probably codified into law. And I guess what I wanted to sort of start off with is, if you could, I completely understand the purpose of a point person on housing and needing someone to really own housing policy end to end. I guess my question would be, and I appreciate that we're trying to live within some of the old confines and structures, but maybe help me understand a little bit around what would the role of the Housing Resources Commission really be versus the coordinating committee. I see that the difference in membership is, adding folks that have field expertise and things like that. Is it just one extra layer where it'd be better just to have the coordinating committee be able to take testimony and take feedback from additional interest groups versus creating a whole nother, commission? Help me understand what the reason is why we need kind of both bodies.
Yeah, I can take a first crack at that. Chairman, first of all, we're not creating new bodies. These exist. We're tweaking them and we think strengthening them. The HRC itself is the body that receives resources, for example, in key categories like homelessness, and allocates them. We want to enable the broad array of stakeholders to be represented, yet we want to have slightly fewer people, 20 people on that body capable of carrying out that work. So we want to make sure that it's not rigidly structured where we have certain representatives, albeit very good representatives, but not representative of other portions of the community. But we want to create something that can allocate funds, and it would continue to do so. So it exists for that purpose. The coordinating committee exists for really a different purpose, which is more of an overarching coordinating role across the government. Given that there are funding streams that go to Rhode Island Housing, and we hope to add some here under this article, we have HHS funding streams that are dedicated to HHS and its agencies, and ought to be, but interrelate heavily with some of the programming. We want to have a place where all of that can be hashed out and coordinated, and we want a person who does the job of serving that coordinating body, toggling among the different agencies in government. There have been other proposals for a deputy secretary to carry out that work. We view those two things as one and the same. So there's an executive director on the books. We think that person should carry deputy secretary status, so we give them that title, and they do that work.
So I hear that point. I guess we've had both the Housing Resources Commission and the Housing Resources Commission coordinating committee on the books for a while. Do we know the last time they actually met and how frequently they're meeting?
Well, they meet. Mike Tundra, can you speak to the frequency of meeting or most recent?
Sure. Thank you, Stefan. Yeah, the HRC generally meets on a quarterly basis, so it is much more regular than the coordinating committee itself. As has been mentioned, the coordinating committee's focus is much more, by statute, was really much narrower than it is in the proposal. It was really to work through the operating relationship solely between the HRC and Rhode Island Housing, and that body. That smaller group really has not met. So that's part of the reason why the new proposal expands that membership to recognize that there's really a benefit for the HRC to coordinate across multiple state agencies, including EOHHS, Commerce, and others that weren't necessarily in existence at the original creation of the HRC. So much more regular to get fundamentally to your question, much more regular meetings of the HRC itself with that coordinating committee not being regular in recent years.
So, and Chairperson, if I may, the Housing Resources Commission plays a really fundamental role in trying to make sure that we've got the diverse voices that state government needs to hear on housing. And I mean, it's got private sector representatives, it's got nonprofit representatives, it's got housing advocates who fight tirelessly for communities all around the state, and it's really it's about trying to make sure that we're living up to the what the state deserves. So I think that dialogue, we're trying not to lose that, even while we're creating more capacity on the state government side. If that helps.
No, I think it does, Hannah. And listen, I think we want to make sure that we have the right representation, and we want to make sure that we get the stakeholders that we need to for good policy. I guess the only concern that I am just trying to think of, and we can certainly continue to discuss as we go forward, is just we don't want to make anything too big, which I recognize that your proposal is actually to shrink the council. When something gets too big or the mission gets too ambiguous, I think sometimes we can lose focus to be able to do that. And as an example, and and I really don't mean this in any other way, but I think one of the missions of the Housing Resource Commission was like every 5 years a strategic plan for housing. I think the last one that was done expired in 2010. And I'm happy to be corrected if that's not accurate, but what my concern is that if we don't have a very clear mission, a clear set of individuals that are driving something forward, we may try to get a broader group of stakeholders, but one of our major issues is housing, and we haven't had a policy since 2010 if that statement's correct. So just want to make sure that we're thinking through around what is right for the right feedback level, but also for the tactical execution side, if that makes sense.
It makes enormous sense. And just to be clear, Chairman, we are aiming to reduce the number of people, yet have the right set of voices represented, and to have an even more tightly managed, more effective body. That's exactly what we're aiming for, without being too disruptive, without compressing this process too much so that people are uncomfortable with the level of representation, just the number of people. So we're trying to strike that balance, but that is our major goal, is to make it more efficient and more effective.
Okay. All right, Senator Palmer.
So thank you, Chairman. Just to follow up on that, Secretary, it hasn't met one of the groups or whatever. And I went back and I'm looking at Article 16 again.
The coordinating committee, the HRC,
Understand? Yep.
the funding allocation committee, it certainly does.
And they're part of the Finance Corporation, right? Looking at
Part of which, I'm sorry, they're not part. Would you say that again, Senator? I'm sorry.
Yes. The where is it here? Looking for the language. I just referred back. The commission.
The commission.
The 7-member, moving to 9 now, adding in the Executive Director of Housing Resources Commission.
That's right.
And the chairperson of the Housing Resources Commission or designee gets added as the commissioners for the, we're expanding that by 2. That's the
Hannah, do you want to speak to the numbers themselves?
Sure. So that's actually, I believe, Senator, that's the Rhode Island Housing Board. So what we're aiming to do is try to make sure we're connecting in these existing bodies and the new executive director, deputy secretary to the Rhode Island Housing Board.
Correct. So given that one hasn't met in a while, as the chairman indicates, we're looking to create it again. Wouldn't it be better just to keep it in one? The more, sometimes having a dual entity provides the counterbalance of another. But if it hasn't met, is there any value of keeping it? If they haven't met and we've accomplished what we've accomplished, right, wrong, or indifferent, maybe we didn't accomplish what we needed to because they haven't met. But if you can answer the question, if they haven't met, why even have it? Let's not much medicine in it if they haven't met for a while.
The HRC or some equivalent body is very important. We need a body that represents stakeholders and allocates funding. On the coordinating committee, quite frankly, we could probably do it within the administration. That is to say, we could call a task force together. What we think is important here is, quite frankly, what we're looking to do is acknowledge that the coordinating committee is dormant.
Yep.
That we still need to coordinate within government, that we need to make sure HHS, Commerce, Rhode Island Housing, and other stakeholder perspectives are represented. We could do it without the legislation, quite frankly, and ignore the coordinating committee, or it could be laid to rest. But we actually think it's important, and it should exist as a structure. That function that we just described, the interagency dialogue, there is no easy structure for it right now.
So, Mr. Chairman, just quick follow-up.
Sure.
So I would expect that's the function of HHS. That's why we created it back 11 years ago now, 12 years ago now, somewhere in that vicinity. Senator Sisnowski or Senator Felag will remember better than I, but I think it was probably 10 or 11 years ago now. The expectation is that the Executive Office of Health and Human Services should be doing that. Why not just leave it there rather than create yet another group that's got to meet? I'll move my hand over here somewhere.
Senator, I think what that is, it's extremely important that EOHHS be heavily involved. That's one of our main points, but let me just be clear. OHCD is an Executive Office of Commerce agency. Mr. Mike Tondra's agency is Commerce. The most frequently coordinating body for the housing agencies of the state is the Executive Office of Commerce. So what we're trying to do is unify that. We certainly dialogue extensively, and to their credit, Rhode Island Housing and OHCD coordinate extensively with HHS, but we want that to happen at a higher level. We thought the imprimatur of the legislature might be very helpful, but you wouldn't get a major objection from us if you said to us, you know what, do that within the administration. We would certainly do it, but it wouldn't happen within just one executive office effectively, speaking for one executive office.
Okay, thank you. I don't want to belabor it. I just think it's the case of it hasn't met. Let's bring it within government. If you need to have whatever resource, bring those resources to the table, but we can at least hold ourselves accountable. It's hard to hold accountable a group that hasn't met, right?
Thank you. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator.
Okay, Mr. Secretary, I believe we can proceed to the tax section.
Yes, Chairman. Thank you, sir.
I'm glad to bring you all through the tax section. So what changes are made in Article 16 to the real estate conveyance tax? I think an easy way to explain this it would be to go through what changes and what stays the same. So what does it change? It essentially creates a new tax bracket, if you will, for the real estate conveyance tax on the portion of sales for the amount of the sale above $700,000. So for a property transaction above $700,000, the portion of it above $700,000 is subjected to a new tax bracket. The current tax is $2.30 per $500 of assessed value. That's the convention that's used. So it's a 0.46% tax. And this doubles that tax amount for the portion of the sale above $700,000. It only assesses this new tax bracket on residential transactions, so commercial sales will not be assessed the new rate. And additionally, it diverts about 1/4 of the existing real estate conveyance tax general revenue portion. It diverts that to the housing production fund. So the state sacrifices some general revenue to help ensure that there's adequate revenue to support the housing production fund. What doesn't change is the portion of the real estate conveyance tax that is passed through to municipalities. What doesn't change is the portion that goes to the Housing Resource Commission. It's just the state general revenue portion is decreased, and the housing production fund is the beneficiary of the new tax bracket, if you will. It invites a natural comparison to last year's proposal. So I did want to take a minute to compare what was included in Governor Raimondo's fiscal 21 recommended budget with what is here in Governor McKee's fiscal 22 recommended budget. It adds a new general revenue contribution. So the fact that the state is putting some skin in the game in the form of diverting a portion of general revenue to the housing production fund is new. It also does not subject commercial transactions to this new tax. And it also raises the threshold for the new tax increment to $700,000 rather than $500,000. So the intent of that increase from 500 to 700 is for a couple of reasons. One is to recognize some of the appreciation that's happened in recent years. In response to Senator Acosta's question, I did quickly look up the growth in this tax base, in this tax revenue, the real estate conveyance tax over the past couple of years. In fiscal 20, it was 9.2%. In fiscal 21, it was 10.2% or 10.6%. So that reflects both the number of transactions as well as the value of individual transactions. It's been growing dramatically in the past couple of years. So even in 1 year, it probably warrants some increase in that increment. And the other intent of increasing the threshold from 500 to 700 is to adequately ensure that the middle segment of the market is avoided, and that this applies to something that is a significantly larger than average or median value home. For example, in calendar year 2020, the median sales price was approximately $319,000. So this is something that's in the range of twice the value of a median sale. Some of the details are shown here. In the footnote, I did want to note that some amendments are forthcoming. Following submission of the budget, we were informed by DOR of some corrections and updates to the revenue estimate that affect the general revenue portion of the tax. Previously, we've been assuming that 16 cents of the real estate conveyance tax would have generated $0.9 million in the first year in 22 and 1.9 million thereafter. Those figures have been updated by the Department of Revenue, so we expect to submit an amendment there. And the administration would also like to signal the intent, as Secretary Pryor noted, to submit an amendment substantially similar to what was included in last year's budget regarding avoiding that double taxation scenario that results from certain affordable housing related developments that utilize the low-income housing tax credit program. I'm glad to answer any questions on the tax components of the proposal.
Senator Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Joe, I hear what you said here. I went through the legislation. With regards to, let's just talk about the current, or the legislation as if the house is $699,000, right? Or the $2.30, okay? Can you just articulate the end components of the money where it goes to? Like I said, I've been through the legislation and what we've had in the past, but could you just walk through those constituent parts?
Sure. So in the base portion of the tax, the $2.30 per 500, a total of 90 cents is retained as general revenue. And in the law, that's written as 60 cents of general revenue and 30 cents that goes to fund the Distressed Communities Relief Program. The recent history is that the state has funded the Distressed Communities Relief Program at an amount more than the 30 cents out of 500 of the real estate conveyance tax. So we essentially consider both of those components to be general revenue. 30 cents out of 500 goes to the Housing Resources Commission, and then $1.10 per 500 is retained by the municipality in which the property is located.
Okay. And that leaves the remaining 60 cents.
I believe that should total up to the full $2.30. So the 90 cents plus 30 cents, $1.20 plus 110 should be $2.30 per 500.
Okay. In the legislation, it says the state shall retain 60 cents for state use.
Yes.
I'm changing that, provided 16 cents per 60 cents shall be contributed to housing production for the established pursuant, etc. Right?
Yes, so 16 cents according to the legislation. So that what I was referring to was under current law, and then this proposal would reduce the state general revenue portion by 16 cents. And that would then be dedicated to the Housing Production Fund.
And so there's 44 cents that goes to the general fund.
Mm-hmm. Yes, 44 cents plus, if you want to consider the distressed communities relief portion.
I'll put that aside for a second, because that's targeted and dedicated to those two different areas, housing resources and distressed community, correct?
Yes, traditionally we've considered the distressed communities relief portion among the general revenue component, in that more than that amount is usually appropriated for distressed communities relief.
But we're also putting 30 cents into the Housing Resources Commission as well.
Correct.
Okay. Given that, with regards to the there's 44 cents that's unaccounted for as it relates to housing. Correct?
Correct. We are not diverting the entire general revenue portion to housing. A significant portion remains. A significant portion remains as general revenue. I think the fiscal 22 revenue estimating conference estimate of the realty transfer tax was, I believe fiscal 21 was $15 million, $15,400,000. So that gives you an idea of how much general revenue is generated by this. And we propose devoting only about $3 million of that going forward.
That's the 16 cents, or that's the combination of the two pieces.
So the tax under current law generates about just over $15 million of general revenue. And this proposal, once it's implemented for a full year, would divert about $3 million of that to the Housing Production Fund.
Okay, that means there's 12 million going to the general fund.
Correct, approximately.
Okay, so we have 12 million going to the general fund that comes from housing that goes to fund other things within government.
Correct.
Okay, so I just think about, Mr. Chairman, like we've done in the past with transportation, where we basically said transportation is important. There's an urgent need for it. And what we did over a period of time was move and transition. It took us longer than we should have, but we moved the vehicle registration fees, the driver's license fees, vehicle inspection, I think, but clearly the first two, those got moved over to the infrastructure trust fund that we created. I would suggest that we look at, over time, modifying this language that says over a period of N number of years. Because if we do that, the borrowing of $65 million potentially goes away. And we don't have to spend another N 20%, 30% on top of that or more over the course of paying it back. More of that could go towards housing. So,
No.
thank you.
I think it's a very fair point, Senator.
Thank you.
Are there any questions, other questions from the committee? I don't see. Mr. Secretary, before we sort of move on to the rent relief section of the presentation, listen, I think housing is a major issue. I think it's one that will certainly be focused on not only through this proposal, but I also believe through a lot of the federal proposals. We're about to talk about the rent relief, but I think there's an opportunity for us to consider doing a lot more from a financial side with some of the Stimulus Act money that's coming through. I guess my question, though, would be, is this a problem that is squarely solved with money? And I say that because, one of the things that as I think about a full housing strategy, whether it be low-income housing, workforce housing, or even housing as you go up the income ladder, is scarce in all of the buckets as you go up. And I think all of us are hearing from our constituents who are having a hard time finding affordable housing at any income level. I guess my question would be, is there a broader coordination of policy that has to happen here involving literally availability of land, space, contractor, licensing? What else do we need to do to, regenerate more of those housing starts that we would likely need to meet the demand that's coming? And how do we foresee this structure driving us to reach some of those other answers for what do we need to do besides some of this direct dollar investment?
It's a central question, Chairman. I think it is a central question. And I do think that we need a body like the coordinating committee in order to enable us across the disciplines of government to arrive at a strategy and to perpetually coordinate to get this job done. So, does it need to be this coordinating committee? Could it be something that we arrive at within the government? Again, we can even put that issue to one side, that particular question to one side. We need to coordinate across these disciplines and have a strategy. So that is what we're proposing to do. The additional point I would make is you're right to say, or to ask the question, is this all about money? To be sure, it isn't just about money. Now, we're coming from so far behind on the subject of funding that we do need to dedicate more funding to the task. And in my mind, we need to do so in a way that's sustainable beyond any period of time where stimulus is available. We need to acknowledge that this is going to be a multi-year process at a minimum in order to get ourselves where we need to be. There is a culture we need to build within Rhode Island also pertaining to the kind of community-state collaboration that lets local control govern these activities entirely, but that lets us find opportunities where towns would definitively benefit if we were to build more housing stock. I think one of the ways to build towards that is to knock down some of the financial and, let's acknowledge it, psychological barriers to development, including that school costs will go up. One of the things that I think we'll demonstrate, I want to acknowledge this up front, one of the things that I think we will demonstrate as we calculate per pupil increases in communities that hypothesize and explore new housing development is that per pupil costs might not go up at all, or might not go up at the rate that might be guessed at because of declining enrollment, because of capacity within existing school physical plants, because of efficiencies if class sizes don't need to grow. It depends on the exact scenario, but I think we need to use dollars to help us tackle those problems and arrive at solutions that communities, if they consider the problem themselves on their terms, might decide to solve. So that's a partial answer, but I think it's a very, very good question you're asking.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Mr. Secretary, and I agree with much of it. I'm looking at this chart from the beginning of the deck, right, that sort of shows, the housing permit activity, and some of that for sure is, the state's investment directly in affordable housing. Some of that is, the environments have changed on the local side, and we need to overcome some of those hurdles. But the declination is so steep that you also have to believe there's some fundamentals in the construction industry and in the builders industry that's driving that sort of a decline, right? When I talk to a lot of builders that I just know from my district, the consistent thing that I hear is, Ryan, there's no money in me building a house that's less than 2,600 square feet. And that's, for one way or another, collectively through the policies we have at the state and local level, is driving that profit incentive, right? And the builders just aren't going there. They're building fewer houses and they're building them bigger at higher price points, and that's where the profit margin is. And so there's just a much broader conversation there around, yes, all of this we need to do, right? We need to make sure that the state's living up to its obligation, but I don't want us to lose fact or sight of the fact that there's a broader industry issue that I think we need to delve into a little more on this topic.
Very much with you.
Okay. For members of the committee, are there any other questions on the Article 16 proposal before we proceed to an update on the rent relief program? And I can't see everyone, so if you do have a question, just speak up, please.
Senator Felag.
Senator Felag.
What is the greatest need in housing? Is it the homeless people we have? Is it the elderly? Is it the single person? Is it the young person with children? And can you expound on what type of assistance do you provide in terms of that housing? Is it a single house? Is it a duplex? Is it what they're talking about in a lot of communities, little small houses? How do you see the state moving forward on this? Or what is the need?
Yeah. my main answer is that we have needs across income strata and of different housing typologies. We need all of it. I will say, if I had to say what's the most pronounced need right now, it is affordable and workforce housing, because we're in the midst of a pandemic and the accompanying recession, and people at the lower end of the income gradient are truly struggling. And it's absolutely essential that we enable people to remain under a roof. And if people who are seeking affordable housing can't find a home, they may very well end up homeless. So if I had to pick an area that would be our greatest emphasis among multiple areas, it would certainly be affordable and workforce housing. But we've done some surveys and some analysis recently in the last, say, 2 years. And I don't know if Chris and Carol would be able to speak to this right now, but Carol and Chris, we've done some analysis with some consulting firms for Rhode Island Housing that show that at higher income levels, people are getting crowded out and purchasing at lower income strata. Can you just say a word or two about that, Carol and Chris, just to explain how the problem really is widespread?
Yeah, people who have the ability to be a bit mobile, they can, they could occupy a property that has rents that could be affordable to someone, say, at a 60% of area median income when their income level is 80 to 100%. So they tend to squeeze out the lower income folks that are making far less than what these people at the upper end of incomes are making. So we do see that squeeze out of people who would appropriately fit within or could afford the rents that people at a higher income level are making. So I certainly agree with the secretary. We need housing across the spectrum. And you mentioned the homeless individuals and families in the state of Rhode Island. And certainly they need housing, and they need housing that's deeply subsidized with, tenant-based vouchers or other rental assistance that we see on a national level. But the real answer is we need more housing, period, right? So we need housing at a workforce level all the way down to providing housing opportunities for homeless individuals, Senator. It's just a lack of inventory in general in Rhode Island.
Well, then, beside money, is it land that's posing a problem, or is it zoning within various communities? And how do you find land within an urban community such that you can revitalize?
Yeah. And I think it's all of that, as the secretary mentioned. It's all of those things that play into impediments to development and growth of housing. But we are doing development in, the urban core. We're doing development in the city of Providence and in Pawtucket and Central Falls. So while you may think that they're built out, there's plenty of opportunities to build in our urban areas, as in our suburban and rural communities as well. We need housing, maybe not the same kind of housing, but we need affordable housing in every single community in Rhode Island.
And what type of housing do you build? Do you build duplexes, or do you build single family, or what other types do you build?
All of that. So, multi-story apartment developments, duplexes, single family homes, buildings that have 4 units with commercial on the lower level in our urban core, right along the main corridors. So you do all of that because there's a need across the board, Senator, for that kind of housing.
Yeah, I could see how it would be apartments and stuff above businesses, because those individuals would be in most need for busing in particular.
Yeah.
And those would be along the busing routes that would be imperative for their existence in terms of getting to a supermarket or getting to a doctor or those types of things. Thank you.
Certainly. Yeah.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Felag. Are there any other questions for members of the committee? All right, hearing none. Thank you, everyone, for the presentation on Article 16. I do know that we also reserved some time in the agenda for an update on the rent relief program. I want to thank Rhode Island Housing for, I know you've participated a couple times to give updates to the committee, and we've had a chance to speak offline as well. And I just want to say I think there's a very large program coming to Rhode Island Housing, and I know that everyone on the Rhode Island Housing staff has been working hard to prepare for this, and so appreciate your efforts and appreciate your update to the committee tonight. Carol, I assume you may want to take the lead here?
Chairman, I'll actually turn it over to Chris Hunsinger. She's going to make this presentation for you. Happy to answer questions, though, if I can jump in anywhere.
Great. Thank you so much. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I just want to start by giving you an update on the rental assistance programs that we ran last year with the CRF dollars. Housing Help and Safe Harbor, $13.5 million was allocated to those programs, and we are winding down. So the last applications will be paid out by next Wednesday, and all of those dollars will be dispersed. There is a pile or bucket of applicants that will not be able to be paid out with those dollars. There just weren't enough. We're moving them into the new program. So folks who had completed an application who were not able to be helped under the old program will be moved into the new program as priority candidates. So next slide, please. You can just see here's the track record of the payout, the changes that we made to facilitate moving quicker in this program were made in late October and implemented the first week of November. And you can see they worked. So the dollars were able to get out. Next slide. So here we are with the Rent Relief RI. That is the name of the program. It is funded by Treasury's ERA dollars, $200 million to the state of Rhode Island to facilitate payments for rental arrearages, utility, and utility arrearages. The folks who are eligible for this program are at 80% of area median income or below. They're renters and renters only in this bucket. There are other dollars coming for homeowners, but in this bucket, it's just renters. Someone who in that household has to have been on unemployment or qualified for unemployment or suffered a reduced income. So maybe their hours got reduced, but they weren't eligible for unemployment, or suffered another financial hardship due to COVID. And folks to qualify for this program have to be at risk for experiencing housing instability or homelessness. That can be demonstrated by just owing back rent or owing back utilities. So those are the criteria to qualify for the program. The program will offer assistance with rent arrearage, utility, and home energy costs. Applicants who qualify will be eligible for up to 12 months of assistance. That's where the standard amount is kind of set, the 12-month mark. In exceptional cases to preserve stability, they will allow, Treasury will allow us to go up to 15, but the typical amount will be about 12 months. Treasury requires that we prioritize folks who are at 50% of area median income or and folks who have been unemployed for 90 days or more. We are allowed, as in creating the program, allowed to create other prioritization categories in addition to those, and have done so. We will prioritize anyone who has notification from the court. So if they've had, they have an eviction hearing that's scheduled, or have an eviction order that's been that has yet to be executed because the moratorium is in place, those folks will be prioritized in the system so that we are able to help them first and fastest and prevent them from being evicted once that moratorium is lifted. Right now, the moratorium is scheduled to end on the 31st of March, so next week. The dollars are available in this program through September 30th of 2022. We are grateful for that deadline because originally it was December 30th of this year, and it's a lot of money and a lot of folks who need help, but it was a truncated timeline. So we are grateful that that deadline has been extended. There is a piece in the law that says that 65% of the funds need to be spent by this September, or the federal government can begin to claw back the remaining dollars. We understand, or are not certain, but understand that Treasury will likely issue guidance that says if a state is making progress and working towards obligating and spending those funds, that they don't intend to begin that clawback at that September mark. That has not happened yet, but we are hopeful that it will. Next slide. So we have signed a contract with the state to administer the program. Guidance for the program was issued at the end of February and then again on March 16th. So already changes to the program, and we haven't even opened yet. We procured a technology platform, selected that vendor, and the contract with them is signed. We are working every day and every night to get it up and running and to make sure that it is a good system and that it will be working pretty soon. The Board of Rhode Island Housing has approved a call center vendor. We are working to finalize contract with them so that they can support folks who need assistance in filling out applications, and they will also help to process applications. The board also approved a roster of local partners to help Rhode Island Housing get the word out and assist folks with their applications as well. So we've made a really strong commitment to make sure that no group is overlooked, that we are able to reach people in a language that they're comfortable in, that we are covering the state, making sure everyone knows about it and everyone is able to apply, and to make sure that we are not overlooking those traditionally underserved and overlooked populations. So we've got a list of local partners who are going to help us with that, and hope that we are able to get everybody who is eligible, who needs help, into the program. There's currently a landing page up now at rentreliefri.com. You can go there and see information about the program, get a sense of the documents that you'll need to apply and to sign up for notifications for when the program goes live or if there are changes. So that's up now, and we've got over 1,000 folks who are registered, ready to receive notification that the program's gone live. So they are waiting. We held a video conference with all invited the mayors and town managers to come and discuss what the program looks like, how they could participate with us, and how to make sure that if they are also offering rental assistance programs, we don't duplicate those efforts. Make sure we don't pay for the same expenses for the same folks twice, and have to try to claw back that money. So we are beginning to roll out those kinds of meetings and trainings for partners and for anyone who is interested in collaborating and partnering with us. Our goal is to go live next week. We're working really hard to make sure that that can happen. And I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them.
Thank you so much, Chris, for the update. I think a lot of progress happening here, and look forward for the program getting off the ground soon. I know that Senator Palma has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Christine, well done, as expected. Two quick questions for you. And this next question may be Senator Acosta's from the past. I don't recall, so Senator, if this is yours, just say so and I'll defer to you. I think it's been brought up in the past, but this is rental assistance. I understand that. We'll talk about mortgage in a minute. In the case where we want to ensure that an individual can stay where they are, living where they are, want to ensure the person who's renting it can pay their bills. Is there restriction, Christine, that it has to be the rent? Can it be the mortgage that gets paid? If it's whichever's less, if that makes sense, or if the rent. That's one question.
Sure.
By the way, that might be. I apologize, Senator Acosta, if that was your question the last time, but it's a good question.
rental assistance is in fact landlord assistance, right? So if the tenant, tenant is helped and allowed to stay in the home, the landlord receives those funds to either pay their mortgage or to use those dollars for whatever to meet their other bills. So this is really a program that helps both landlords and renters. It pays rent. It doesn't do mortgage relief. There are dollars that are coming in the American Rescue Package that are for homeowners and to help pay mortgages. But this program does not do that. It's very specific in the guidance.
No, Christine, I appreciate that. Again, obviously I wasn't clear on my point, so I'll work to clarify it. It's rental assistance, and it's rental assistance for Lou to live where he's going to live or where he lives. Mm-hmm. But if the mortgage for that property, or maybe there's a minimum that gets set. If the mortgage that the landlord needs to pay is less than that or something, how do you? Are there caps on the rent? Rent goes up, we pay more because they can pay it.
So there are no caps on the rent. We work to make sure that the rent is the dollar amount that's being reported by the tenant and by the landlord is in fact the agreed upon amount. That can be done in a number of ways, showing a pattern of paying that dollar amount, or it's specified in the lease. So we do, but we pay the full rent. So this program assists renters and landlords. It doesn't make a judgment about the dollars that are being charged for rent. It doesn't do that.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, one other follow-up if I may.
Sure, Senator. Okay.
So, Christine, thank you for the update there. I think it's one of those areas where knowing how much money is here, right? $200 million, you said, or it's a lot of money. I can envision someone looking outside and saying, wow, not that I can make some money here, but as a landlord, I could just pass this along because it's time to up the rent and do whatever with it. So I'd ask that at some point in time, a month from now, do a compare and contrast of have rents changed from 1 month to the next where they really haven't changed before, to try and keep an eye on that to make certain the renters are not being taken advantage of. So.
And we have a lot of controls in place to make sure that the rent is, like I said, what was agreed upon and what was being charged. So we're going to pay arrearage and can approve for some forward-facing rent, but that'll be done at the point of application. So if you come in with 4 months back owed rent of whatever dollar amount, $100, we will approve you for if you qualify, approve you for the forward-facing rent for that same dollar amount for the 3 months that you would be eligible for. So it would be a very rare circumstance where that dollar amount should be in flux in that particular.
Okay.
Person.
Christine, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator. Are there any other questions or comments from the committee? Okay. Hearing none, Chris, thank you so much for the update this evening. We do appreciate it. We do have several individuals that have asked to testify this evening related to Article 16. So the first, we are going to go to Caitlin Fremier, the Rhode Island Coalition for the Homeless, in support of Article 16. Caitlin, welcome to Senate Finance.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can.
Great. So I am Caitlin Fremier. I am the Executive Director of the Rhode Island Coalition for the Homeless, and I just want to thank you, Chairman, all the committee members, and certainly Rhode Island Housing and the Commerce Secretary for their presentations. I think they've done a great job in kind of illuminating the importance of some of this, so I'll kind of keep my remarks brief, as I don't know that I need to restate everything that's been said. But I'll just highlight what I think has been alluded to, which is just the devastating effect that the lack of housing at every level, and particularly the lack of affordable housing for people who are the most vulnerable, what the impact of that is. We've seen our number of people living outside, for instance, triple, right? Where we used to have maybe 60 or 75 people living outside a night, we're now, facing upwards of 200 at periods during the COVID pandemic. So not only are we seeing an increase of people that are facing, housing instability, they are kind of being forced to kind of live outdoors because there isn't enough, and it's a problem that's kind of compounded each year. So I think the article that you have in front of you, particularly the creation of a permanent funding stream in the budget through the conveyance tax, is absolutely needed and will not only build housing and be an economic development driver, but will quite literally save lives. And I think this pandemic has shown much how kind of health and welfare kind of intersects. So I just want to say, we can't end homelessness or even begin to kind of address the dent without affordable housing and investment that exists regularly and not just in a bond or kind of what HUD money trickles with its restrictions. And, I would say that we are, also supportive of the changes to kind of some of the executive kind of office management. I'm actually a housing resources commissioner and sit in that group, and I would agree that the changes that have been proposed, I think, would be helpful. It can be hard to have a large group, and I think there's some tension between, policy work and kind of long-term planning that needs to occur, and then kind of operational administrative tasks. So I think they've smartly kind of separated those out a little bit and provided connections. And so we are also just, supportive of these other changes. The inclusion of the cities and towns also need to be front and center in this. So I think we're really across the board just very supportive of these efforts and grateful to the state, both the governor and this committee, for considering them. I don't know if I'm able to take questions, but if anyone has any, I'm happy to talk more about my experience at the coalition or as a commissioner.
Thank you so much, Caitlin, for your testimony. Are there any questions or comments from members of the committee? Hearing none. Caitlin, thank you so much for your testimony this evening.
Thank you so much. Have a good day, all.
Thank you. We also had Courtney Nicolato sign up to testify, but will not be speaking this evening, has just submitted written testimony in support of Article 16. Next to testify is Stephanie Geller with Rhode Island Kids Count in support of Article 16. Stephanie, welcome to Senate Finance.
Thank you so much. I'm Stephanie Geller, the Deputy Director at Rhode Island Kids Count, and I really appreciate the opportunity to provide testimony today. Rhode Island Kids Count strongly supports Budget Article 16. I think there was a wonderful presentation earlier this evening about it, so I won't go into great detail, but more talk about why we support it. We're very supportive of the idea of having a permanent and regular source of funding that can be used to plan, produce, and preserve affordable homes for Rhode Island residents, including families, seniors, people with disabilities, and working people, and to expand housing-related resources for cities and towns. As was said in the presentation earlier, Rhode Island has an urgent housing shortage. The supply of housing is not keeping up with demand, and the cost of housing is far outpacing wages. Even with the recent bond passage, Rhode Island significantly underinvests in housing compared to our neighboring states. At about $20.45 per capita spending on housing, we're spending less than half of what Maine spends, and about 1/5 as much as Connecticut and Massachusetts. In fact, we're the only state in the Northeast that doesn't have a dedicated revenue source for this purpose. So we feel that a permanent, stable source of funding will help us narrow this investment gap and build the homes our state needs to support both our families and our economy. In terms of why Rhode Island Kids Count is particularly invested in this budget article, we've been following for a very long time about the connection between housing quality, affordability, and the effects on children and families. And we know that poor quality, unaffordable, and crowded housing has a negative effect on children's physical health, development, and emotional well-being. And when it's unaffordable, also on a family's ability to meet their children's basic needs. If they're paying too much for housing, they can't afford childcare, health care, food, and other basic necessities. We also know that families that pay a lot for housing more than they can afford often live in low quality and overcrowded housing and move frequently, all of which have been linked to increased absenteeism, lower educational achievement, and risk of homelessness. And we know the converse, too, which is that high-quality, affordable housing that's safe, affordable, and located in well-resourced, low-poverty neighborhoods helps children do better in school, and their parents report improved mental health. So we urge you to support this budget article and create this much-needed dedicated funding stream. We know that we need more safe and affordable housing, even more than we did before because of the effects of COVID, and it's urgent that we address these needs now and plan for the ongoing investments in housing that will be needed in the future. Thank you so much for the opportunity to testify.
Mr. Chairman, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Stephanie, thank you so much for your testimony this evening. Are there any questions or comments for Stephanie from the committee? Hearing none. Thank you, Stephanie, so much for your testimony this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, that does conclude our witnesses that we have signed up to testify this evening and does conclude our agenda. So I want to thank the members of the committee and all of our guests this evening. Senator Palmer makes a motion to adjourn, which is seconded by Senator Acosta.
Second.
All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night.
Good night.